Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historic research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, The Wolf Woman. This is your monster of the month. It's a story from the 1920s by Bassett Morgan, or Grace Morgan. She used a male pen name. Be aware that there is some period racism in it. The monsters included, there are three, are a sort of ice vampire, her attendant direwolves, and a revenant woolly mammoth. In a deviation from my usual methods, the statistics for these creatures, and last week's creature from Gibbet Hill, are all available now on the blog that accompanies the podcast. Now over to Ben Tucker from LibriVox.
The Wolf Woman by Bassett Morgan, read by Ben Tucker. Beaten back by fogs and blizzards of the heights, the Stanwell party was camped in a sun-warmed valley at the base of Mount Logan, which lifts its ice-capped head in eternal solitude and awful silence above the most intensely glaciated region of the world. 3 years before, in an attempt to follow McCarthy, who first ascended Logan, the intrepid mountain climber Morrissey had fallen into a crevasse, and Professor Stamwell was now attempting to recover his body from the glacier and, by a process of his own experimentation, restore it to life. His assistant, Lieutenant Cressy, who had been more intrigued by the adventure of the climb than by Stamwell's sanguinary hope of resuscitating flesh entombed and even perfectly preserved in the ice, was reluctant to admit failure. Nevertheless, he enjoyed the sun warmth of the valley after the terrific frost fangs and ice claws of the heights. Along the shores of a little river whose source lay in the glaciers, the dogs romped, catching fish with the dexterity of the husky breed, and gorging themselves. Baptiste, the big half-breed Canadian guide who looked after the comforts of the men, had been roving all day. At supper time he returned, tossing his cap in the air and yelling excitedly. "Monsieur," he shouted, "I have find one funny mans who makes things of ivory. You come and see. You like him very much." Nothing loth to leave the discussion of their defeat, Stamwell and Cressy followed the exuberant Baptiste for a mile or two along the river to a stoutly timbered cabin beside which an old man watched his supper cooking over a fire outside. At sight of him, Cressy laughed, while Baptiste explained his new acquaintance. "His name is Joe. He is half Indian, half Eskimo, and I savvy he talk very fine." While Baptiste talked in a tribal jargon, Cressy's amusement mounted. The old man was toothless and wrinkled. A beaded band kept the lank hair from obscuring his sight, and as his jaw wagged constantly on a quid of chewing tobacco, 2 knobbed knuckle-bones of seals thrust through slits in his cheeks gave the appearance of tusks. Ragged wolfskin trousers and elk-hide moccasins completed his attire, but he smiled grotesquely as he led the way inside the cabin. There he lighted a wick floating on a dish of oil, threw wide a window shutter and let in sunlight, which revealed a collection of carved ivory objects on shelves about the walls. Baptiste was even more eager than the carver to display his skill. He handed Stamwell a figure copied from comic supplements of newspapers and familiar in homes from the Arctic Circle to the Florida Keys. A moment later he brought forth its mate. Stamwell held in his hands cleverly chiseled likenesses of Mutt and Jeff. Flattered by the interest of these white men, Joe showed them the source of his inspiration, a sheaf of old newspapers from the pages of which he took his ivory models. Baptiste, convulsed with mirth, laid in Cressy's hand a figure which brought a responsive laugh. "She got bellyache," he shouted. Even Professor Stamwell chuckled at his description of a lovely little September morn. They spent a good deal of time with the contents of the shelf before Joe took up the oil dish and threw a flickering light on a recumbent figure in the cabin corner. Stamwell went on his knees, and Cressy gasped at the beauty of a woman, carved in ivory, lying as if asleep with one arm under her head, and her long hair draped over her shoulder. The figure was almost life-size, and the ivory block showed no seam or joint. Stamwell touched the slender leg with gentle fingers, then looked at Cressy. "Cressy, this ivory is of different texture from the small figurines. I should say it was fossilized, but where on earth would the old fellow obtain such a huge block of material?" "And the woman model," exclaimed Cressy. "A white woman, undoubtedly. Look at the sensitive nostrils and straight nose, and the rounded cheeks. No Cogmillic or Indian squaw posed for this. The old fellow didn't create her, either. He couldn't. You can see he has only a great skill in imitating and copying. Baptiste, ask Joe where he saw such a woman asleep." Baptiste's conversation with the old man occupied some time, and before it ended the big guide was fingering his scapular. "Joe, he say dis woman froze in ice. He get dis big chunk ivory from ver big land whale, also froze in ice." "A land whale? Cressy, he means a mammoth. We've come across real treasure. Baptiste, tell Joe we would like to see this land whale." Baptiste interpreted. The ivory carver nodded good-naturedly and started at once to lead them to the source of his art material. "Joe, he say," offered Baptiste, when the dogs were harnessed and food on the sled in case of an overnight trip, "he say, dis woman's is frozen in ice long time. Maybe this summer fetch her out. She come down ver fast, long time ago. Joe see her very high up. Joe say more as 100 snows when he first see her." "Frozen in the glacier more than 100 years ago? Preposterous. The old fellow exaggerates." Stamwell waved aside Joe's veracity. "We've evidently stumbled on a tragedy. Snow madness makes its victims strip naked, usually, which would account for her nudity, and Joe looks aged, but I don't credit his 100-year memory." "Her hair must have touched the ground, Professor. That dates her pretty far back." For some hours the ice trail, steep though not perilous, claimed their attention. The sun swung down to the horizon for the brief moments of northern midnight, then began its upward arc. They found that Joe had cut steps on the glacial river which wound down from the grim sides of Mount Logan. Mounting steadily, they reached a terrace which led to lofty pinnacles of ice, so clearly blue it was like a fairy palace, where steps led to an outstanding archway, a natural grotto of rock that had been broken from its base and carried down. Inside the grotto, the light was weirdly blue, the ice underfoot clear as glass. Joe pointed and Cressy knelt, and a moment later his cry echoed from the grotto walls. Under the crystal shell lay the carver's model, more beautiful than the carved ivory, a woman, young, lovely, golden hair half-robing her form. Tawny eyelashes on her rounded cheeks. Nearby, as if they had lain down to sleep and been caught by instant and painless death, were 7 large hounds or wolves, with snow-white pelts. Baptiste, plagued by superstitious fear, gazed long and earnestly, then leaped from the cave with a wild cry and ran down the steps which led to the broken end of the lower terrace. Cressy and Stamwell, engrossed by the sight beneath their feet, did not miss Baptiste until he returned, holding his nose and grimacing. "Name of a name. She smell ver dead, that land whale." They followed him to the terrace, below which lay the enormous carcass of a hairy mammoth in advanced stages of putrefaction, smelling, as Baptiste had said, very dead. One great tusk lay on the tundra, the other had been sawn off, proving Joe's assertion about the source of his ivory. Cressy was staring at the mass below in absorbed silence when Stamwell clutched his arm and exclaimed, "Cressy, we did not find Morsi, but we found this woman. By heaven, we'll take her and the dogs from their ice tomb." But what a pity," cried Cressy. "The air will finish them in no time, like that mammoth, and she is beautiful in death." "Another summer would bring her down to that finish anyway," argued Stamwell. "And what if it isn't death? What about its being merely suspended animation? Here is our chance to test my discovery. I meant to try it on Morsey. We can't do that for him, but what a triumph to bring this woman back to life after God alone knows how many years of sleep. A Diana of Eld and her hunting pack." "But aren't you interested in this mammoth at all, Stamwell?" "What is a mammoth? Decayed at that." Stamwell's eyes burned with the passion of a zealot. "Mammoths have been found everywhere, their skeletons mounted and their existence traced. We shouldn't have even the satisfaction of originality, but to carry out a living woman who has been buried in the ice, no one can say how long. Cressy, look at those hounds." Stamwell was hurrying to the cave and growing more excited every moment. "Do you know of a living breed of dogs like them? They are true wolf, even larger than the timber wolves, and albinos. It is stupendous, staggering, the antiquity revealed under this shell of ice. And to think, if we had been a year later, this superb discovery would have moved down with the glacier and broken off at the terrace, the prey of wild animals, the bones scattered. That will happen next year, unless we rescue her." Cressy did not answer. The idea of taking this frozen beauty from the ice and restoring her to life sounded like the talk of a man demented. Yet as he heard the calculating plan of Stamwell unfold, Cressy admitted to himself that It was a new and alluring adventure. At Stemwell's succinct commands, he accompanied Baptiste to the valley camp to bring back their packs and establish a camp in the grotto, which penetrated the flow for 100 feet or more, and would serve admirably as a shelter. By the time Baptiste had made beds of pine boughs and started a fire with wood hauled from below, Cressy found that Stemwell had made remarkable progress in chipping the ice from the entombed woman and her dogs. The guide cooked breakfast. The cave had assumed an appearance of comfort exceeding their valley tents, and after a meal of flapjacks they slept. Cressy was wakened by the noise of Stemwell's pick on the ice.
"What if that hammering should start an avalanche?"
he asked. "There isn't much danger. The sun warmth melting the ice also welds it, and the flow is less crisp here than in higher altitudes. Don't think up discouragements, Cressy. Get busy and help me." They worked all day, cutting a rectangular space which included the entire group. Baptiste and the half-breeds had slept huddled in parkas in the tents erected outside the grotto, which they refused to enter except to carry out the broken ice. It was apparent to both Stemwell and Cressy that their men regarded this disturbance of the ice-entombed woman as a sacrilege that would brew trouble, and Baptiste solemnly voiced prophetic warning.
"Dogs," he snorted. "Who ever see dogs like them? They look more like Ghost Wolf, the loup-garou. Me, I don't like this business. I come for to climb mountain, not dig up dead womans."
Nor would he gaze into the deepening hole where Stemwell and Cressy labored until only a thin shell of ice covered the bodies of the woman and hounds, when Stemwell called a halt. "We must prepare things for her resuscitation, Cressy. Help me with these packs." They toiled until Cressy reeled with weariness, preparing ice slabs covered with furs, arranging apparatus, pulmonary respirators, hypodermics, bottles of precious distillations known only to Professor Stemwell, blankets and kettles of hot water. "If you should be tempted to give an account of this to the world, Cressy, I trust you will guard the secret of my process," said Stemwell that night.
"Obviously," answered Cressy, "since I haven't the faintest idea of success in such a preposterous attempt to cheat death."
Buoyed up by excitement, Stemwell seemed unwearied, but Cressy was glad to lie down, and it seemed only a few moments of sleep when again he was awakened by Stemwell's chipping ice in the task of extricating one of the white hounds. By noontime they were lifting it from the hole and placing it on a fur-covered slab of ice to roll in blankets and be gradually warmed with hot water cans until the 9-inch length of fur fell wet and limp as it thawed. It was some time before the flesh grew pliable, for the beast measured 11 feet from snout to tail tip, and was all the two men could manage. With sweat pouring down his face, Cressy obeyed the crisp commands of Stemwell with trained military precision, while the professor applied one after another of his processes, and both took turns in expanding and contracting the great fur-clad chest by sheer strength, and manipulating the hypodermic of fluid which started heart action. Then Cressy felt a twitching of the body muscles and saw the legs jerk. He could scarcely credit his sight as Stemwell poured small doses of prepared broth down the dog's throat, and it swallowed them with a faint, gurgling whimper. Stemwell's cry held triumph. In vain Baptiste announced mealtime. The sun had dipped and begun another day before the great hound was swathed in blankets and furs, and the two white men took the hot coffee they sorely needed. "Eureka!" shouted Stemwell, beside himself with joy.
"And now that the beast is alive, what will we do with him?"
was Cressy's rejoinder. "Take excellent care of him. Take him down to the valley as soon as possible, where Baptiste can feed and look after him." After a brief 3 hours of sleep, Stemwell roused Cressy and they exhumed another hound, going through the same laborious work as before, to be rewarded eventually by recurring animation. By that time, the first hound was able to take boiled meat and showed ravenous greed, and after the meal it attempted to struggle to its feet, but was still weak. In 3 days it left the blankets and took a few staggering steps, then lifted its magnificent head and howled mournfully again and again, a sound at which Baptiste made the sign of the cross and muttered Chippewayan incantations against evil. When 10 days were gone, Baptiste was delegated to escort a pack of 7 white hounds, for which stout leather collars and light chains were provided, to the valley. With him went all the half-breeds except one, who remained to cook for the white men in the grotto. Baptiste had orders to hunt game and feed the hounds and keep the sled dogs on leash at the cabin of the ivory carver for greater safety. With the grotto cleared of the dogs, Stemwell turned his attention to the central block of ice. The hypodermic needles were carefully sterilized, and the greatest care and precautions taken as they lifted the crystal casket from the hole and carefully thawed the ice embedding the woman. Sweat poured off both men while they worked, and their breaths came in sharp hisses long before the first sign of life was evinced in a whispered sigh from the pale lips. Stamwell's eyes were shadowed to the cheekbones, and he seemed to have aged years when the muscular twitching of her slender legs began, and a sigh of agony quivered into the silence. "If you've had your flesh frozen and thawed, you will understand the pain she feels," said Stamwell. "I almost regret inflicting this suffering upon her, but when she pulls through and realizes that she is alive, then, Cressy, I shall be repaid." Cressy's thoughts denied that potential gratitude. Suppose this woman had been dead any great length of time and found none of her own generation alive in the world. Would she thank them? Cressy doubted it. But she was so lovely that he lost all sense of dread, and felt only a vast pity in his heart for the beautiful creature lying in the red blankets, her golden hair spread like a silken veil on the colored wool. It was almost midnight when her eyelids fluttered open and the two men saw eyes of purple softness, which moved slowly as she seemed aware of the two men, and firelight illuminating the dark ice of the cave. The blueness left her fingernails, and color returned to her lips as she fed hot milk and broth. Then her eyelids closed and her body relaxed in sleep. Stamwell was like a man insane with fear, until he applied a stethoscope to her breast. "Thank God it is sleep," he cried. "But there will be no peace for me until she is out of danger. While I watch her, you had better rest. Cressy, do you realize that I have brought the dead to life?" To Cressy, his cry was a challenge, a sacrilege. He felt something of the same uncanny fear which Baptiste had displayed at Stamwell's assumption of supernatural power, and wondered if it were beneficence or crime to restore that lovely creature to life after her long sleep. His sleep was troubled because in the valley the great hounds howled all night. Dozing, waking to curse them, he saw Stamwell beside the woman's couch, and rising he bade the professor sleep while he watched. He made coffee and carried a steaming cup to his seat beside the sleeping beauty, sipping it as he gazed at the sun-gold creeping down the glacier to the grotto door. A sigh roused him. A white hand touched his wrist. Turning, Cressy was aware that the violet eyes of the woman gazed at him, and she smiled. Then her fingers touched the tin cup he held as if she was thirsty. "I can't give you that," he found himself telling her as if she understood his talk. He reached for a bowl of broth simmering on the alcohol stove, heavy with meat juices and nourishing tonic medicines, and fed her. Color tinted her throat and cheeks. She seemed momentarily to gain strength. Cressy was thrilled and awed by the miracle happening before his eyes, and shocked at the languorous coquetry of her glance and the white fingers clinging to his hand. Again he fed her, aware that she was ravenously hungry, until the broth was finished. He thought she was again asleep until her hand lifted her golden hair and trailed it across his face, and a low-toned, throaty laugh startled him. Feeling helpless in the face of a crisis, he replaced the golden tress on the couch, and felt his fingers tingling as from a light galvanic shock at its touch. He leaned forward, and instantly his neck was circled by her arms and she pressed her face against his throat. Cressy was so astonished that he did not try to draw back, and an instant later he felt her teeth on the flesh of his neck. Alarm and swift revulsion seized him. He was afraid to tear her arms away for fear of bruising the tender skin. He knew her heart beat under the forced stimulation of Stamwell's drugs, and feared a sudden shock might halt its action. Then, while he hesitated, a strange drowsiness clouded his senses and stole over his body. He felt no pain where her teeth pierced the skin of his throat. Her arms were satin smooth. The warmth of her lips tempted him to rest in the alluring embrace. Then a cry from Stamwell roused Cressy from drowsiness that nearly swung into blissful unconsciousness. He was wrenched from her arms and felt the sting of flesh her teeth released. Glancing at her, he saw her lips moist and crimson-stained, and she was struggling in the clutch of Stamwell. "Fill that hypo with the medicine in the third bottle, quickly, Cressy. She is so strong I can scarcely control her." Cressy obeyed, even to inserting the needle into the skin of her arm. Her scream was piercing as she fought Stamwell, who held her until the drug took effect, and she sank back, relaxed. Then Stamwell turned to Cressy. "Good God, man. I trusted you to stay awake and watch." Cressy did not reply. Stamwell was disinfecting the wound on his neck, to which he applied a pad of cotton gauze and adhesive tape. Cressy could not even smile, nor would he tell Stamwell how she had coquetted with him before catching him in her arms. A few minutes later they saw Baptiste toiling up the glacial drift, and from outside the grotto door he called to them.
"Monsieurs, I cannot hold those dog. They grow so big, so strong, and my men is scared they break them chain. I am very scared those dog myself. Me, I am good dog man, but not that kind of dog. I feed him 19 rabbit, 7 coyote, 1 elk, and much fish in 1 week. All my men do is hunt for feed those dog. Me, I am about ready quit my job. I take sled dogs and tie him across river, cause if those white dog get loose, well, we walk back outside."
"Cressy, the white hounds must not kill our sled dogs, and Baptiste must be pacified, for if he deserted we should never get our menagerie out alive. I think we can take the woman down to the valley by tomorrow. Suppose you go down now and look after the camp." Following Baptiste down the ice trail, Cressy saw the ivory carver industriously sawing off the remaining tusk of the mammoth, and watching him a moment he slipped and fell headlong. He was only slightly stunned, but a worse calamity had befallen, for in extricating his foot from a small fissure, he felt the snapping of bone and a dull pain. Cressy cursed.
"Baptiste, I've snapped a bone."
The warm-hearted Baptiste lifted him to his shoulder and made his way down to the valley, where their arrival started a terrific din of howling dogs and answering yelps of the sled huskies leashed across the river. Baptiste muttered oaths.
"If those white dog get loose, they swallow my dog like I swallow loche liver without chewing him."
He commented and grumbled his distaste of the whole business of the grotto miracle. Baptiste was about ready to desert, and it occurred to Cressy that he had better summon Stamwell at once. The great white hounds leaped the length of their chains, and the sturdy pine trees were swaying and jerking from the lunge of their powerful bodies.
"Baptiste, we'd better fetch Professor Stamwell and his packs down at once, and we'll make a start outside,"
he said. Again Baptiste took the trail to the grotto, while Cressy soaked his foot in hot water, then bound it with wet moss and cotton. The cook was preparing supper. The other men had gone to assist old Joe to fetch his big mammoth tusk to his cabin. Then they all came to where Cressy sat, and one of the breeds translated Joe's talk.
"Monsieur, he say it is not good to stay where devils come to life. This white wolf is devil wolf. This woman is devil woman. Joe, he say we better froze the dogs and womans again and go out quick."
"He's a timid, superstitious old man," said Cressy.
"The dogs are savage, but the woman cannot harm anyone."
Yet as he spoke, Cressy felt uneasy. The gauze pad on his neck was a reminder of his personal experience with the woman. He ate supper and waited impatiently for the coming of Stamwell, but it was nearly midnight when he saw Baptiste coming down swiftly, alone. The big guide broke into excited cries as he ran toward Cressy.
"Monsieur, la professeur is dead, and la femme, she is gone." "Gone? Stamwell dead?"
echoed Cressy. Baptiste crossed himself and muttered broken snatches of Chippewan mingled with Roman Catholic prayers, looking apprehensively at the hounds. The dog stood silent but alert, ears stiffly pointed and sniffing the wind.
"Monsieur, in the cave, everything toss this way and that. The professor, he is lay on floor, and his throat he's got bite. His hands, they look like they soak in water long time."
Like a blow from a bludgeon, the explanation crashed on Cressy. When Stamwell dozed, the woman had caught him as she seized Cressy, possibly draining his blood like vampire bats of southern caves, and renewed strength had left the grotto. He remembered that she was unclad, and the air of the ice fields bitterly cold. With his injured foot he was hampered in reaching the glacier, and nothing he could say or do would persuade Baptiste and his men to search and bring the woman to the valley. Stamwell's death had come so suddenly he could not yet realize the tragedy. Then he noticed that the dogs were rousing to uncanny excitement, whining and growling, tugging strenuously at their chains. Cressy began to regret bitterly what had been done and longed to break camp and escape from the weird influences loosed by Stamwell and himself. Baptiste saw him look toward the ivory carver's cabin.
"Good monsieur, we camp tonight in Joe's house. It is not good to be here."
"No." Under Baptiste's commands, the men toiled to carry everything to the cabin. Then they set about strengthening it with a barricade of young firs quickly cut down and heaped about the log walls.
"The good priest, he say all trees is made by le bon Dieu,"
explained Baptiste.
"And name of a name, we need him this night to keep us safe."
Cressy could only nod assent. for as he dropped on a couch of freshly cut pine branches, he was aware that stealing over him was that same blissful unrest he had felt in the arms of the death-delivered woman of the glacier. He felt possessed of a wild desire to find her and thrill again to the touch of her satin arms and her mouth warm on his flesh. He knew it for an evil thing, a worse craving than whiskey or dope, and found himself battling the weakness of flesh with arguments prompted by reason which his lips betrayed to Baptiste.
"It is cruel to let a woman wander alone on the ice. If you do not go and find her, Baptiste, I will."
The breed's dark face was grim with dogged determination.
"Monsieur, you do not leave this cabin. Not if we must chain you like one dog. Me, I think you have evil curse on you."
And Baptiste barred both door and window of the cabin, which held 8 men, until within an hour of midnight the air had grown hot and foul, and Cressy demanded fresh air. Reluctantly, Baptiste threw open the window shutter and admitted a bar of diminishing sunlight. The white hounds were giving tongue in unearthly howlings, mournful as dog wailings which, to the superstitious folk, announced death, and the blood of Cressy was leaping as at the cry of a hunting pack. He hobbled to the window and looked toward the glacier where Stamwell lay. Even now he could scarcely realize that his friend was dead, and again he urged Baptiste to open the door.
"No, for my life, monsieur. Look!"
There in the river of slow-moving ice stood the huntress, poised daintily on her toes as if in a dance, her arms uplifted to cup her hands at her lips, her long golden hair blowing about a body as softly rounded as a young girl. And on the midnight silence came a clear, ringing cry. Instantly, pandemonium broke loose among the white hounds. Their howls were deafening, and the clink of chains made wild metallic music, and they leapt and fell back and leapt again. With their heads thrust through the window opening, Baptiste and Cressy watched, leaning back against men crowded behind them, as one of the hounds snapped his chain and raced like a white cloud in great swift bounds towards the glacier. Within a few moments they were all free and flying to the heights, where they leaped about the woman with joyous yelps until she was hidden by a frenzied tumult of gigantic hounds. Then, seemingly at her command, their yelps ceased, and they were squatted on their haunches at her feet, pink eyes shining like rubies in the soft twilight, red tongues lolling and quivering from white-fanged jaws. Again she cupped hands to her lips and sent out her hunting cry. At the sound, Cressy shivered. In every nerve he felt the piercing lure of that wail. She was calling him forth, and some hell-born desire to answer and go to her was fighting every prompting of reason. Again came her call, and Cressy plunged from the window toward the door. Baptiste was too quick for him, and thrust his own great bulk against the timbers, flinging Cressy aside.
"No! Monsieur, are you crazy? Look!"
Baptiste had snatched a small silver crucifix from inside his shirt and clamped it against Cressy's forehead. He felt it searing his skin like white-hot metal, and he sank to the pine couch, shuddering, sweat breaking out on his face. At Baptiste's command, the men held Cressy down, and again Baptiste flattened the crucifix over his breast and repeated bits of prayers strangely mixed with the incantations of his Chippewan mother's teachings. The sweat grew clammy on his body before Baptiste released him and gave him whiskey from an emergency flask. A somber group of men waited in the cabin until the sun was sailing high and the last faint howling of the white hounds had dwindled to silence. Cressy slept and wakened to see the door open and feel the warm wind blowing through the cabin. Then Baptiste brought him coffee and flapjacks hot from the pan.
"Monsieur, I said to Joe that we use one sled to carry out his big tusk. We have sled to spare, now we don't carry out medicine packs. Today we break camp."
Cressy considered in silence, his mind quite clear. The horror of the night frenzy vanished with the sunlight. He could not, would not, go outside and leave Stamwell's body without decent burial, and said so.
"Monsieur, what happened his body makes no never mind. Me, Baptiste, say you do not go to that cave no more. It is la chasse du diable." "Call it what you will, Baptiste. I do not leave here without placing the body of my friend out of reach of wolves. Perhaps already the white hounds have found it. If so, I shall be haunted for life." "Me, I think that is happen already, monsieur," commented Baptiste. "But now they are gone. Maybe we go fetch down le professeur."
Baptiste had clashed wills with Cressy before, and met defeat. Yet when they dragged Cressy up the ice trail on a sled,
The breed wore crucifix and scapular in full view on his breast, and every man did likewise. They found no trace of the hounds, not even pad marks on the snow. The grotto showed signs of a struggle, but fortunately Stamwell had packed his medicines and instruments. His body lay on the couch, relaxed before rigor mortis set in, and his face had even the semblance of a smile. But on his throat was an ominous white mark of strong, even teeth, and the visible skin was puckered as if his veins were empty. Otherwise the corpse was unmolested, at which Cressy marveled until he remembered that the white hounds had been supplied with meat by the men. The gaping ice-hole presented a solution of a temporary tomb, and Professor Stamwell, blanket-wrapped, was laid deep, the broken ice shoveled in, and heated water poured until the grave was filled and already freezing, safe against depredation. It was while that task engrossed him that Cressy felt the force of the tragedy and a growing desire to avenge the murder of Stamwell, and he forgot the weird spell of the night in which the untombed woman had tempted him to follow her by the memory of her beauty and blissful languor of her caress. It was cowardly to run away now, nor had he any proof of the tale he must tell of Stamwell's death when he was again outside. Then he remembered that since the conquest of Mount Logan by McCarthy, other parties had set out, and he knew approximately the location of 3 groups headed for that ascent, all hard-headed mountain climbers and scientists. Giving orders to Baptiste to dispatch men in search of these expedition groups, he started up the glacier in spite of the vehement protests of the guide, who just before leaving on the valley trail tossed over Cressy's head the deer-skin thong holding the crucifix.
"One very good priest bless it, monsieur. You take care of him for Baptiste."
Irreligious himself, Cressy respected the faiths of other men and humored Baptiste. Then, drawn on a sled by 2 breeds, he adventured the heights, watching for a glimpse of the woman. They had traversed a considerable distance, had seen ptarmigan tame as chickens, and edelweiss growing through the snow. Halting to pluck one of these brave little blooms, Cressy saw something glittering over a flower that seemed withered and first unfolding, and he picked from it a long, glistening thread of golden hair that curled by some attraction of warm blood about his fingers. The snow glare was blinding. The wind whistled keen as whiplashes, and to eat their meal sheltered from its cutting blast, Cressy ordered a detour toward a group of ice spires, which on closer inspection proved a labyrinthine entrance of shining columns leading to a second grotto. Leaning on a stout fir branch used as a cane, he limped down the passage, then halted in alarm. Low, menacing growls and clanking metal told of the hounds within, and a moment later they had leaped forth, a cloud of white death. Cressy turned to run, knowing how meager was his chance for life. His revolver was in his hand, but as shots rang out, the hounds circled past him, apparently untouched, while he reeled in shocked amazement that he had missed a hit at such close range. Screams from the ice entrance brought his heart to his throat, cries of the 2 breeds that were drowned in the Bay of Wolves on the kill. Cressy stood paralyzed, unable to prevent the dreadful carnage, unable to save his men, even while he pumped lead into that swirling, milling cloud of destruction now fighting fiercely over the mangled remains of their victims. Weakly he leaned against the ice wall, his senses reeling as he reloaded his revolver with trembling fingers, knowing lead was impotent against these ghost wolves, for he knew them now to be more than flesh and blood. They were some infernal incarnation, invulnerable to man-dealt destruction. A high-pitched, ringing call, clear as a bugle, brought his gaze to the grotto when he saw the woman standing against the blue gloom, golden hair wind-blown, poised on her toes. She glided, dazzlingly lovely, toward him with arms outstretched, and in his last moment of reason, Cressy threw one wrist up to shield his eyes from that dread allure. Then again, he felt the fierce desire of her, and flung out his arms. She came within 5 feet of him and halted, a puzzled expression on her features, her hands sweeping and weaving as if she tried to tear from between them some barrier invisible to Cressy. When he tried to seize her, she retreated, still fighting at the space separating them, until man and woman reached the entrance to the ice passage, where the dogs leaped back from too close a contact. And with a gesture of despair she turned and ran, calling in her ringing voice and leading her pack to the heights. Cressy fell on his knees beside the gnawed bones of his men, and heard his own cries imploring her to return. Sweat rained from his face, his body quivered. He was a man corroded by the poison of an evil desire. After a long time his head lifted and he clutched at the crucifix on his breast. Then reason gradually conquered, and as he pressed it to his head and lips, he felt the sun warmth and cool wind and knew he was himself. Slowly, painfully, he retraced his trail down the glacier and found Baptiste had reached the lower grotto and was searching for him, frantic with fear.
"The 2 men are dead, eaten by the white hounds,"
he told Baptiste, and shuddered at the breed's cry of horror.
"Take me down and bind me in the cabin, Baptiste. I am a man accursed." "Help will come with those men I send out, monsieur,"
comforted Baptiste. But they waited for 3 days, seeing nothing of the white hounds and woman, until one man returned, a trapper old on the trails, and with chattering teeth told a tale of horror.
"White wolves broke into the first camp I get to, monsieur, and I find only 1 man alive. He tell me of la chasse du diable, then he die. Monsieur, I am very old man, but I hear when I was baby of this chasse du diable from my grand-grandpère, and his grandpère tell him."
For a week they waited the return of the second man sent out. Then one morning Baptiste reported men coming up the valley, and Cressy hobbled to meet them.
"Thank God you've come," he cried. "My name is Cressy. My companion, Professor Stamwell, is dead, and I have a tale to tell almost beyond belief."
"I'm Johnson," said the leader of the newcomers, "and I think I know something of your story. Your man told us a little, and we found the Stillwell camp ravaged. A terrible sight. I'm worried about another party toward the west, for we had a friendly wager as to who would first climb Logan. But I am amazed at the hunger of wolves in summer, that they attack men."
"These are more than wolves, Johnson, as Baptiste will tell you."
Cressy began to relate his adventures, omitting nothing, not even his own accursed desire, which had recurred each night, and which Baptiste fought with incantation and holy symbol.
"Laugh if you will. To me it is horrible," he ended.
"I'm not even smiling. Your face shows the strain, Cressy. But have you nerve enough to accompany me and the men to the grotto again?"
"Of course. Waiting here is hell."
Johnson and Baptiste held weighty consultations while Cressy lay on the grass, too pain-racked to take part. His lips twisted in a sneer when the men made rude crosses of wood and gathered a blanket full of windflowers, those pale blooms which Indian converts say spring up where angels' tears have fallen, and loaded sleds. Cressy was oblivious to everything but the fact that he was returning to the grotto where he had seen the huntress, and with a low cunning that shamed him, he was plotting a meeting with her that should cradle him in her arms. They threaded the passageway of ice turrets, carrying pine torches which gave smoky light to the blueness of the grotto, as Johnson examined it, then flung himself on the ice floor with a cry.
"Cressy, for God's sake, look! Here's a mammoth, as I'm alive. And other beasts. Lord, man, some mighty convulsion of nature must have herded your huntress, her wolves, and other denizens of her long-departed era into close quarters and caught them. Good heavens, if your secret process will restore the woman and wolves, why not try it on bigger game?"
Cressy laughed. The evil spell of the place had caught Johnson, and if he could be persuaded to carry out this wild scheme of digging up this frozen mammoth, there would be time to seek again his huntress and find the lethe of her embrace. Through ensuing talk, Cressy was enthusiastic. The men were sent to bring the packs from the first grotto, and the digging began. About the cave entrance, the wooden crosses were arranged with arms touching, and draped with windflowers that were also scattered on the ice trail. Cressy's own men and Baptiste refused to assist the ice digging. Joe, the ivory carver, was still below in his cabin. Nothing would persuade him to take part.
"Old Joe declares this woman and her dogs are evil, yet he seems unafraid,"
Cressy remarked one day.
"Joe," interrupted Baptiste, "he may say he too old, and have not much blood. He say he make charm in his ivory womans. When this hunter womans come, he pick up axe and smash ivory womans. And the ghost womans go away, and never come back."
"Oddly enough, the natives of the South Seas and Africa have the same belief," said Johnson. "They make an image of some enemy, and either burn it or put it in water to rot, and the object of their venom sickens and dies. The world, Cressy, is small."
That night, as the sun sank lower, came the howling of wolves, and Cressy felt the prickling of his scalp and leap of blood. Although toil-weary, the men were awake, and guns in hand they watched the great white hound streaking down the glacier, led by the flying huntress. Cressy started for the ice passage, but Baptiste leaped and bore him down, his great weight pressing the breath from the smaller man as he struggled and fought in sudden rage. Subsiding, he laughed, but the sound of his laughter was unpleasant even to his own hearing. It seemed as if the party had small chance of defense against those ghastly, ravening death wolves, but to the amazement of every man, the pack halted abruptly beyond the wooden crosses, and the huntress stood there twisting her white hands as if baffled. The crosses and blessed windflowers had turned the hunt, but there began hours of fearful waiting until the pack circled the pinnacles, even leaping over the grotto arch and howling from behind the fence of crosses over the cave entrance. The sun was well above the horizon when they drifted away. Night after night, the diabolic chase returned only to retreat, baffled by barriers they could not break down. By day the men slaved to unearth the frozen beasts belonging to an era when the north was tropic swale. Baptiste, who hunted in the valley for fresh meat, reported that Joe was carving a second figure of the huntress, standing upright, extremely lifelike, and that he scarcely left his work to eat or sleep. At last the great hairy mammoth lay clear of ice, and because they had no means of lifting its immense weight from the hole, Cressy and Johnson built fires about it, shielded from the carcass by screens of flattened oil cans until it was thawed and restoratives from Stamwell's stores applied. Blankets and fur robes were shoved under it by leverage of cut pine sticks, and all hands rubbed the gigantic limbs and trunk with rough pads of twigs bound together by coarse grass. It was a Herculean task, and the men were exhausted before the monster shuddered, stirred his mighty body, strained ponderously while everyone scrambled out of the ice hole. Then, heaving himself to his knees, the mammoth staggered slowly to his feet. As the puny humans fled from his path, he crushed the ice under his forefeet, burst the ropes with which he had been bound, and lumbered out of his tomb, his tusks crashing down the ice pinnacles of the passage and scattering the protecting crosses. Then he lunged to the glacial river and went tottering to the valley. Cressy, white-faced and shaking as he realized the titanic grimness of the thing he and Johnson had loosed, ordered the trek to begin immediately down the ice floe to the valley. At the same time he realized that, working with pick and shovel, concentrating on the healthful task of manual labor, he had liberated his mind and body from the huntress's evil sway. He no longer paid attention to the midnight chasse du diable, and he slept soundly through the baying of ghost wolves. He breathed deep draughts of the balsam-laden valley warmth as they approached Joe's cabin, reverently thankful for his release.
"Baptiste," he said gently, "you have looked after me, and I am grateful. I have been caught in the power of hell, but it is gone."
Baptiste caught him by the arms and looked deep into his eyes.
"Oui, monsieur. No more I can see that woman shape in your eyeball. All this time it was there, and I know you are in her power. Now it is gone."
Cressy felt a tremor of apprehension. He had not known that the image of the huntress was photographed on the retinas of his eyes until Baptiste spoke of it. He held out his hand, and the breed gripped it in solemnity of silence that was like prayer. Then he pointed to the almost finished figure at which Joe worked assiduously, never lifting his hands from the task. The delicacy of his skill was never so apparent as now. From the ivory base, still shrouding her feet, the huntress seemed to dance, wind-blown hair, curving limbs, round young breasts so perfect that it seemed a pity he could not, like Pygmalion of old, breathe life into this Galatea. Cressy put out a hand to touch it, but Joe waved him aside and yelped a warning.
"He say you must not touch her, or you have devil in your liver some more," translated Baptiste. "Tell him I shall buy her and pay well," said Cressy, but Baptiste returned a disconcerting negative. "Joe say he keep her for to lay curse you have loosen this world. Now, monsieur, we go outside."
But this time it was Joe who demurred at departure. His harangue, interpreted by Baptiste, told Cressy that he was responsible for releasing the powers of darkness in the valley, and it was no longer safe to be caught on the trail at night until the evil was overcome. This simple acceptance by the old ivory carver of the presence of terrifying supernatural powers did more to persuade Johnson than all Cressy's talk. "They're merely flesh and blood animals," he argued. We may have to take precautions as we would with any wild beast, but I mean to follow that mammoth and herd him into some museum." In the sun-warmed valley, where fires and cooking spread the comfort of commonplace occurrences, it was easier to lay aside superstitious fears. But when Baptiste's convictions were strengthened by Joe's calm acceptance of peril, Cressy realized he would better bow to their opinion that they take the river instead of land trails on their way out, and for this purpose Baptiste was already cutting timber to make rafts, which were the quickest and most serviceable solution of their need. The long day passed and night closed in again. The crosses, carried down by the careful Baptiste, stood like a fence about the cabin, draped with fresh windflowers, with one gap left by which the men went to and fro on the way to logs they rolled to the river for the raft. Johnson fell into heavy sleep, and Cressy lay near him, smoking the last pipe. The old ivory carver worked by the light of his oil lamp in the corner, although sunlight still shone in at the open window. The sled dogs had been brought and leashed inside the encircling crosses, but Cressy had scarcely dozed off when he heard their whimperings. Rising, he went outside. From far off came the baying of the chase, and he saw the huntress flying down the ice, followed by her hounds. Johnson came from the cabin, and both men stood in that twilight which had grown longer in the waning of summer, which would soon give way to winter. A pale crescent moon danced on one silver toe, a fit companion for that lovely Diana dancing on the ice. "Even now," said Johnson, "I can't believe but that she is a flesh-and-blood woman. Cressy, I'd like to clasp her hand and know for myself." Cressy did not reply. The huntress was coming nearer. The baying of the hounds grew louder. He looked to see that the crosses were in place, and did not observe that Johnson had stepped past them until he heard the cry of Baptiste. Then he saw the dark figure of the man, the radiant white fire of the huntress's beauty, and they melted into each other's arms. With a yell, Cressy leaped the barrier of crosses and raced to where the two stood swaying in close embrace. As if the hounds sensed the symbol on Cressy's breast, they fell back as he approached. He had a swift wonder at their timidity until his hands seized Johnson, who screamed and writhed at his touch, and fought being rescued as the huntress's head lifted from his shoulder, and she slowly retreated, step by step, her moistened red lips parted, showing her strong white teeth in almost a snarl of hatred. Cressy fought to draw Johnson to safety, and as he came nearer the cabin, the huntress advanced, hands reaching, weaving, tearing at the space separating her from her victim, unable to brush aside or combat the force for good protecting him. Slowly the hounds advanced with her, and the cries of the sled dogs made the night hideous, when suddenly the huntress threw back her head and shrilled her wild call. Once inside the barrier of crosses, Cressy dropped the half-crazed Johnson into Baptiste's arms. Then he stared into the brightened light of dawn on the mountains. There were sounds from far off, of crashing brush and thunderingly ominous tread, and into their view loomed the giant of the ancient world, lumbering forward with incredible speed until it reached the woman's side, a dreadful menace which only for the frail barrier could have crushed the cabin and scattered the last vestige of men and dogs. The howling of sled dogs and cries of men were terror-muted for a few moments. Then they were alert. Guns cracked in sharp fusillade, but the ghost beasts neither quivered nor showed signs of a wound. The huntress was screaming at her beasts and waving white arms to urge them on, but they slunk aside until she howled at the mammoth, who caught her in his trunk and swung her to his broad head. There she stood, ethereally lovely and evil, her lips stained by the interrupted draught of human life, while the night waned and the blessed sun shot from the curving breasts of snow on Mount Logan. A cry as of frenzied despair came from her. The mammoth turned, the hounds leaped ahead, and the whole cavalcade vanished in the direction of the ice fields. Cressy turned to find Johnson as mad as he himself had been. "You cur," he howled, "to come between me and my woman. You've had your day, now you begrudge me my hour of happiness."
"Johnson, she killed Stamwell, drained his body of life. She almost killed me, left me like a maniac as she will leave you. Here, this trinket of Baptiste protected me. You shall wear it."
He dropped the thong of the crucifix over Johnson's head, and heard his cry of pain. Cressy knew the white-hot searing of that symbol on flesh accursed, and felt only pity for the man. All that day Johnson moaned, watched over by Cressy, while Baptiste directed the men in their task of making the raft.
"No ghost can pass running water," he said,
and that night the logs were lashed together and the rafts moored to shore trees, and the barrier of crosses was strengthened. Meanwhile, working ceaselessly, Joe had cut the ivory from the feet of the huntress he was carving, and was chiseling her pretty toes with their filbert-shaped nails. He had truly caught the grace of her dancing poise in the slender ankles, and she stood like a fairy molded of mellow gold when the sun touched the far horizon, and brief night began in violet-tinted twilight. Cressy was fascinated by the figure.
"Tell Joe that I must have it. I will pay well. $500, even 1,000. I will take her out with me."
Reluctantly, Baptiste interpreted his demand, and for the first time the old ivory carver showed emotion. Fire leaped in his eyes as he wrathfully waved Cressy aside and refused to consider even so great a sum of money for his statue of the woman. Cressy did not argue, but in his heart he determined to obtain the ivory figure, and fell asleep planning a means to that end. He slept lightly, dreaming of the huntress and muttering in his sleep. His broken talk wakened Johnson, who looked toward Cressy with hatred in his eyes, which changed to cunning. Johnson cautiously slipped the thong of the crucifix from his neck, and it dropped to the floor. Then for a time he lay still, except for the convulsive twitching of his body and the rolling of his tortured eyes. At midnight came the whimpering of the sled dogs and baying of white hounds from afar. Immediately every man in the cabin was alert. They grabbed guns and plunged outside, waiting that dread visitation. The moon was fuller and gave silver light pricked out by velvet dark blotches of the trees. The glacial river gleamed like pearl. Another day and the party would have escaped, afloat on rafts carried by the swift-running stream. But this one night must be endured. The huntress was not alone with her dogs, for she stood on the head of the mammoth which thundered into the plain cleared by his voracious feeding, and about them raced the white hounds. The hearts of the men were seized by icy fingers of fear even while they poured volley after volley of shots at the advancing horror, and realized as they pulled the triggers that no man-invented mode of death could halt them. The old ivory carver Joe alone seemed fearless or careless of those terrific ghouls of Eld, for he came leisurely from the cabin, toddling toward the barrier fence of wooden crosses, and peering as if to feast his sight on the vision he had foregone during those nights he toiled at the ivory figure of the woman. Cressy stepped to Joe's side. He had forgotten Johnson in the cabin. There was none to see Johnson spring from the couch and, with the desperation of a madman, seize the ivory huntress in his arms and rush from the door on shoeless feet that made no sound. Cressy's first glimpse of him came when Johnson leaped the barrier of crosses and headed for the river raft. But the huntress had also seen that plunging human, and her cry rang like the long-drawn note of a silver horn. The mammoth lunged forward, the hounds leaped in white arcs of flying fur, and Johnson's scream stabbed through the din of animal howls. They saw the huntress leap from her titanic steed to catch Johnson in her arms, saw the ivory figure knocked from his grasp. The golden hair of the huntress enveloped him like a ruddy silk mantle, and her mouth was pressed to his throat. But a greater tragedy was imminent. As if the scent of human blood maddened it, the mammoth plunged forward, his great tusks lunging between the leaping hounds to stab his human enemy, and the hounds closed in with unearthly yelpings. Transfixed by the sight, the men at the cabin stared at the calamity they were powerless to avert, until there came a loud crunch as the mammoth's foot trod on the ivory figure of the huntress which Johnson had dropped. Then, as if at a signal, the ghost beasts seemed frozen in their tracks, and from them came a glistening white mist which swayed to and fro as it rose and drifted across the face of the young moon, and the watchers saw like a frail cloud the shining form of that lovely hell-born huntress as it blew away on the wind of dawn. Light grew swiftly. The sun came up and shone on a mountainous mass of hairy mammoth flesh and long-furred hounds lying on the tundra. As they stood, chained to the spot by paralysis of horror, every nerve taut, the men at the cabin saw that mound of flesh subside to pulp, and a dreadful stench arose in a smoky steam. By noon there was a gelatinous mass which by nightfall had soaked into the earth, leaving only the skeletons. A clean cold wind from the snows sweetened the air where Joe prodded the bones with a stick to recover all that was left of his ivory huntress, a head on which the features faithfully depicted her inscrutable smile, with lips and teeth slightly parted. Cressy did not offer to buy it. and the head still hangs above Joe's cabin door. One glance at that lovely face had power to recall all too vividly the fate of Stamwell and Johnson, for whom crosses were erected in the valley, and lopsticks nearby carved with their names. Cressy did not smile nor dispute the assertion of Baptiste that he should never return to that valley.
"Monsieur," said Baptiste, "that devil woman's have drink your blood one time, and if some day she come back, she catch you again, because all womans is jealous, and if a woman's get jealous, it opens doors of very bad hells. You do what Baptiste say. You wear little crucifix all time."
And though not a religious man, Cressy has never since been without that symbol.
Your saga may vary. Oh, little sneak peek for those of you who've hung around to the end. For the first issue of Mythic Europe magazine, my article is called Notes on the Martian War.